Fear arrived before the plane's engine finished cooling. It settled into the older brother's chest as he stepped onto the gravel runway, sharp as the Alaskan air. He didn't say it out loud, not yet. He just watched the tree line beyond the hangar, dark and endless, swallowing sound. This place was bigger than the maps. Bigger than the plan they'd argued over for months. Evan adjusted his backpack straps and forced a smile. He was 32, careful by habit, careful by regret. Beside him, Luke looked untouched by doubt. At 26, Luke's excitement moved faster than caution ever could. He laughed at the cold, kicked at the snow, and filmed a quick clip on his phone, promising everyone back home that this trip would be easy. "Just wilderness," he said. "Nothing we can't handle." Evan remembered being like that once, before responsibility learned his name. He followed Luke toward the supply shed, noticing details Luke ignored. The warning signs nailed into wood, the way the pilot avoided eye contact, the silence where birds should have been. None of it felt welcoming. Alaska didn't greet people. It assessed them. Their plan was simple on paper. A short backcountry trek. A few nights camping. Photos, stories, proof they were still brothers after years of distance. What Evan didn't say was that he'd agreed to this trip because Luke needed it. After a bad year, after mistakes that couldn't be fixed, Luke wanted something clean and wild. Evan wanted to protect him. That instinct was older than fear. They loaded supplies, double-checked equipment, and listened as the pilot reminded them where not to go. Luke nodded, barely listening. Evan asked questions. Weather. Wildlife. Distance. Each answer tightened something inside him. Wolves were mentioned casually, like background noise. Evan pretended not to notice the pause that followed. By afternoon, they were hiking away from the airstrip, boots crunching over frozen ground. The forest closed around them quickly, trees crowding together, light thinning into a gray wash. Luke walked ahead, confident, whistling under his breath. Evan stayed behind, counting steps, watching shadows shift between trunks. He told himself fear was normal. Fear meant awareness. But there was another feeling beneath it, heavier and harder to name. A sense that this place didn't care who they were to each other. Brother. Protector. None of it mattered here. When they finally stopped to rest, Luke turned and grinned. "You okay back there?" he asked. Evan nodded, though his hands were shaking inside his gloves. He looked past Luke, into the trees, where the wind carried something low and distant. Not a sound exactly. More like a promise. Only the older one was afraid. And he didn't yet know why that mattered. He didn't mention it, but he kept thinking about the maps folded in his pocket, about how thin the lines were between safety and nowhere. Every step felt like a decision that could not be undone. Evan watched Luke drink water, laugh, move forward, and wondered when fear would catch up to him. Or worse, when it would arrive too late for both of them. Morning came without warmth. Evan woke to a pale strip of light pressing through the trees, his breath fogging the air as he sat up. Luke was already awake, crouched near the packs, chewing an energy bar and scrolling through his phone. For a moment, everything felt normal, almost peaceful, like the fear from the night before had been exaggerated by exhaustion. Luke lifted his phone. "We should send something home," he said. "Mom's going to freak if we go quiet." Evan hesitated, then nodded. He stood while Luke framed the shot, the two of them in front of the tent, frost clinging to the fabric, forest stretching endlessly behind. Evan forced a smile. Luke didn't have to try. He snapped the photo quickly, fingers already numb, and typed a short message about clear skies and easy miles ahead. The photo sent. The signal bar flickered once, then vanished. Neither of them knew it yet, but that image would become evidence. The last fixed point anyone would have of where they'd been, and how unaware they looked. They broke camp and pushed deeper into the trees. The trail was narrower than Evan expected, more suggestion than path, marked by bent branches and faded ribbon. Luke moved fast, confident in the GPS app glowing on his phone. Evan kept checking the compass anyway, counting time, measuring the way the land sloped subtly downward. As the hours passed, the forest changed. Trees grew tighter, their trunks scarred and dark. Snow thickened in shaded pockets. The silence sharpened, broken only by their boots and the faint creak of branches shifting overhead. Once, Evan stopped, certain he'd heard movement pacing them. Luke waved it off. "Probably a moose," he said, like that explained everything. They ate lunch standing, hands stiff with cold. Evan noticed how quickly the daylight thinned, how clouds gathered without warning. He suggested turning back earlier than planned. Luke frowned, checked the phone again, and shook his head. "We're fine. Camp's not far." The first howl came just after that. Low, distant, almost gentle. It rolled through the trees and disappeared before either of them could react. Luke laughed, loud and sharp. "That's wild," he said. "Did you hear that?" Evan didn't answer right away. He listened. Nothing followed. No second call. No movement. The silence returned, heavier than before. They reached a small clearing near dusk and decided to set camp. Evan worked methodically, hands aching as he drove stakes into frozen ground. Luke wandered the edge of the clearing, filming short clips, narrating like it was an adventure show. Evan wanted to tell him to stop, to save battery, to stay close. He said nothing. That night, Evan woke suddenly, heart racing. He couldn't explain why. The fire had burned down to embers. Luke slept hard, back turned, unaware. Evan lay still, staring into darkness, listening to the wind thread through trees. Somewhere beyond the firelight, snow crunched. Slow. Deliberate. Evan held his breath, waiting for another sound that did not come. By morning, the trail they planned to follow would no longer be clear. And the photo Luke sent would already be traveling farther than they ever would. Evan told himself dawn would explain everything, that fear always shrank in daylight, but even that thought felt thin. He stayed awake until gray light returned, listening, counting breaths, wondering how easily excitement had convinced them both that preparation could replace instinct, and how silence could feel like attention alone. Daylight made promises it could not keep. Evan believed that as soon as they started walking again. The gray morning thinned the shadows, but it did nothing to make the forest feel smaller. Snow muted their footsteps, erasing sound and direction at the same time. Evan checked the compass twice before following Luke into the trees. The trail faded gradually, not with a warning, but with indifference. One moment there were bent branches and scuffed earth, the next there was only snow and identical trunks stretching in every direction. Luke stopped and frowned at his phone. The GPS icon spun, searching. Evan felt a tightness settle behind his ribs. "We're still on it," Luke said, more to himself than to Evan. He took a few steps forward, then a few more, confident movement pushing against uncertainty. Evan hesitated. He looked back, trying to memorize shapes, but the forest offered no anchors. Everything looked the same once you turned around. They argued quietly at first. Evan suggested stopping, retracing steps while they still could. Luke shook his head, impatience creeping into his voice. Turning back felt like failure. Moving forward felt like control. The sky darkened as clouds slid together overhead, stealing hours they didn't have. When Luke admitted the signal was gone, something shifted between them. Evan felt it like a door closing. He raised his voice for the first time, words sharp with fear he'd been carrying since landing. Luke snapped back, accusing Evan of overreacting, of always expecting the worst. Old arguments surfaced, ones they never resolved, now sharpened by cold and isolation. They chose a direction by instinct. That was the mistake Evan would replay later. The land sloped downward, trees growing closer, snow deeper underfoot. Evan noticed wolf tracks cutting across their path, half buried but unmistakable. Luke noticed too, but only smiled nervously. "They're probably old," he said. Time stretched. The forest thickened. Evan realized they were circling when he recognized a broken branch they'd passed earlier. Panic hit him fast and hard, tightening his throat. He stopped walking. Luke took several more steps before noticing. "We're lost," Evan said. Luke didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter. "No," he said. "We just need to keep moving." The light began to fail. Shadows lengthened, swallowing detail. Evan imagined the camp they were supposed to reach, untouched, waiting for them somewhere they could no longer find. He imagined night coming fast, imagined sounds returning. His hands shook as he adjusted his pack. They pushed on until exhaustion forced them to stop. The trail was gone, not hidden, not misplaced, simply erased. There was no clear way back, and no certainty ahead. Evan felt fear transform into something heavier. Responsibility. If anything happened now, it would not be an accident. It would be consequence. Luke finally sat down, breath coming hard. He stared at the trees, then at Evan, eyes flickering with doubt for the first time. Neither of them spoke. Words felt useless against the silence closing in. As darkness began to settle, Evan realized losing the trail wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing the forest had noticed them the moment they stopped knowing where they were. And somewhere beyond the trees, something else was moving too. Evan suggested making camp immediately, but Luke hesitated, eyes scanning the dimming woods as if answers might appear. The cold deepened, crawling through layers, numbing fingers and thought. Somewhere far off, a sound rose and fell, too distant to name. Evan felt the day closing around them, sealing choices already made, and understood that whatever followed would no longer belong to planning, only survival. Night was coming, and neither brother was ready for what it would bring. Night fell fast, like someone had turned down the world. Evan felt it the moment the last gray light slipped behind the trees. The forest tightened, shadows merging until depth disappeared and distance became meaningless. Luke stood still, listening, his earlier confidence thinning into something quieter and strained. They worked quickly, hands stiff, setting camp where they'd stopped. The ground was uneven, roots pushing up through frozen soil. Evan focused on small tasks to steady himself, tying knots, stacking packs, forcing order into chaos. Luke gathered branches, moving farther out than Evan liked, his silhouette blurring between trunks. The first sound came as they finished pitching the tent. A low call, stretched and hollow, carried through the trees. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Evan froze. Luke laughed once, too sharp. "That's just one," he said, though he didn't sound sure. A second howl answered, closer. Then a third, farther away, echoing from a different direction. Evan felt his stomach drop. The sounds didn't overlap by accident. They were spaced, measured. The forest wasn't noisy. It was communicating. "Get back here," Evan said, voice low. Luke obeyed this time, stepping close, eyes wide. They fed the fire until it burned brighter than felt safe, sparks climbing into the dark. Evan remembered the pilot's pause, the casual way wolves had been mentioned, like weather. He wondered how many were out there, and how long they'd been noticed. The howls stopped. That was worse. Silence pressed in, heavy and deliberate. Evan strained to hear movement, branches snapping, paws on snow. Instead, there was only the fire's crackle and Luke's breathing, fast and uneven. "I don't like this," Luke said quietly. Evan nodded. "They're not hunting," he said, though he wasn't sure. "They're watching." Something moved beyond the firelight. Snow shifted. Evan caught a glimpse of reflection, then nothing. Luke grabbed his arm, gripped tight. Fear finally reached him, raw and unfiltered. The roles between them shifted without discussion. They stayed awake in shifts, backs against packs, fire dwindling despite their efforts. The cold crept in, finding every gap. Evan's thoughts spiraled, replaying the day, the argument, the moment he hadn't insisted harder. Responsibility weighed heavier than the pack ever had. Near midnight, a shape crossed the edge of the clearing. Then another. Dark forms, low to the ground, circling just beyond light. No growling. No rush. Just patience. Evan understood then that danger didn't always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it waited. Luke whispered apologies Evan didn't answer. There were no words that fit. The forest felt alive now, aware, its rules closing around them. Evan tightened his grip on the knife he carried, knowing it was more comfort than weapon. When dawn finally came, pale and weak, the howls were gone. Tracks surrounded the camp, pressed deep into snow. Luke stared at them, face drained of color. "They were here all night," he said. Evan said nothing. He followed the tracks with his eyes until they disappeared into the trees. Night had shown them something daylight couldn't erase. Whatever followed would be shaped by this silence, by the understanding that they were no longer alone, and that the forest was not finished with them. Evan forced himself to study the pattern, the way the prints overlapped and veered away, not attacking, not leaving. It felt intentional, like a warning delivered without teeth. Luke kept looking over his shoulder, expecting movement, expecting eyes. The night had taken something from him, some belief that confidence alone could bend reality. Evan packed slowly, knowing daylight wouldn't protect them, only reveal consequences. As they prepared to move, the forest remained quiet, but the quiet felt earned, temporary. Evan understood then that whatever waited ahead would not rush them. It would follow. Every step forward would now be measured by hunger, fear, time. Morning revealed what darkness had hidden. Evan noticed it the moment Luke stood and swayed, one hand pressed against his thigh. Blood had soaked through torn fabric, dark against white snow. The injury wasn't dramatic, but it was wrong, and in the cold, wrong things became fatal fast. Luke tried to brush it off, said he'd slipped during the night gathering wood, said it was nothing. Evan knelt anyway, pulling the fabric aside. The cut was deep, edges raw, already stiffening. Evan's stomach tightened. He thought of infection, of slowed movement, of tracks growing heavier behind them. They cleaned it as best they could. Water burned cold. Luke hissed, then went quiet. The forest watched without sound. Evan wrapped the wound tightly, hands shaking despite himself. This wasn't bad luck. It was consequence. The forest didn't need to attack. It only needed time. They cleaned it as best they could. Water burned cold. Luke hissed, then went quiet. The forest watched without sound. Evan wrapped the wound tightly, hands shaking despite himself. This wasn't bad luck. It was consequence. The forest didn't need to attack. It only needed time. Dawn arrived thin and colorless, like it was afraid to stay. Evan woke to silence so complete it rang in his ears. Luke was barely conscious, breath shallow, lips tinged blue despite the layers piled over him. The wound had stiffened, swollen and angry, blood frozen into the fabric. Evan knew then what he'd been refusing to admit all night. Waiting was no longer an option. He boiled the last of their water, pressed it into Luke's hands. Luke's fingers barely curled. His eyes opened, unfocused at first, then locked onto Evan with sudden clarity. He knew. They both did. The forest had narrowed their choices to one. "You have to go," Luke said again, voice rough but certain. "You can still make it." Evan shook his head, jaw tight. "I'm not leaving you." Luke smiled weakly. "You already know that's a lie." The words cut deeper than the cold. Evan packed quickly, hands moving on instinct. He divided what little food remained, leaving most behind. He wrapped Luke tighter, reinforced the shelter, stacked branches to block the wind. Each task felt like betrayal disguised as care. The howls hadn't returned since before dawn, but the tracks were there, closer now, looping the camp like a boundary. Evan avoided looking at them for too long. He focused on Luke's face instead, memorizing it, the way his brow creased when he tried not to show fear. "Stay awake," Evan said. "I'll be back before dark." Luke reached out, fingers catching Evan's sleeve. His grip was weak, but desperate. "Don't follow the river," he said. "It bends too much. Go uphill." Evan nodded, throat tight. He slung the pack over his shoulders, heavier than it should have been. At the edge of the clearing, he stopped. Turning back felt impossible. Not turning back felt worse. "I'm sorry," he said. Luke didn't answer. He was already slipping again, eyes half closed, breath rattling. Evan turned away before he could change his mind. The forest accepted him without resistance. Snow swallowed his boots, erased his steps almost immediately. Evan moved fast, pushing past pain, past doubt. He followed instinct, the slope of land, the faint sense of direction he'd lost days ago. The cold bit harder without stopping, without shelter. Hours passed. The terrain grew steeper, trees thinning, wind cutting sharper. Evan shouted once, just to hear his own voice. It sounded small, easily absorbed. He thought he heard movement behind him and forced himself not to look back. Whatever followed wasn't his focus now. By late afternoon, exhaustion crept in. Evan stumbled, fell, scraped his hands raw on ice-hidden rock. He got up anyway. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering Luke's face when Evan walked away. The first howl reached him as the light began to fade. Closer than he liked. Evan ran. When night fell, it fell hard. Evan pushed on blindly, guided only by momentum and fear. Somewhere behind him, the camp waited. Somewhere ahead, help might exist. The distance between those ideas stretched endlessly. He didn't know then that wolves were already moving through the place he'd left behind, circling something still and breathing, something that smelled of blood and weakness. Evan only knew he was alone now, truly alone, and that whatever happened next would be shaped by the moment he chose to leave. By the time Evan collapsed beneath a stand of trees, lungs burning, legs numb, the forest had already begun writing a different ending for his brother. Evan stared up at the darkening sky, whispering promises to no one, unaware that help was farther than he imagined, and time shorter than either of them understood. Search teams reached the coordinates 11 days after the brothers vanished, guided by fragments of satellite data and a narrowing weather window. The helicopter circled once before setting down, blades throwing snow across a clearing that felt wrong even before boots touched ground. There was no movement, no smoke, only a torn tarp snapping weakly in the wind. The camp was smaller than expected, pressed inward as if something had leaned on it for a long time. Packs lay ripped open, supplies scattered, fabric shredded and gnawed. A single boot rested near the fire ring, half buried, its laces chewed clean through. One rescuer muttered under his breath, then fell silent, training taking over. Tracks were everywhere. Dozens of them. Wolf prints layered over one another, looping tight around the shelter, crossing through it, then pulling back before returning again. This wasn't a passing encounter. It was a pattern, a claim. They found blood beneath the tarp, frozen dark against the snow. Not sprayed. Not dragged far. It pooled thickly, as if someone had stayed in one place too long. A rescuer crouched, examined it, then stood slowly. He didn't run, she said. No one argued. There were no bodies. That absence unsettled them more than anything else. Drag marks led away from the shelter, shallow at first, then deeper, then gone, erased by snowfall and time. Whatever had been taken hadn't gone far, but it hadn't stayed either. The evidence contradicted itself. They documented everything carefully, voices low, movements precise. Each step felt intrusive. The forest stood still around them, as if listening. Even the wind seemed restrained. A ranger followed the tracks as far as daylight allowed, until they vanished into dense trees where the snow lay untouched. Another rescuer focused on the shelter itself. Branches had been stacked from the inside, reinforced with intention rather than panic. Someone had planned to wait here. Someone had believed help would come. That belief lingered in the way supplies were rationed, in the careful order that still existed beneath the damage. The camp felt less like a mistake and more like a final decision. Then they saw the second set of footprints. Human. Uneven. Leading uphill, away from the shelter. They staggered, hurried, disappearing beneath fresh snow within yards. Someone walked out, a rescuer said quietly. Alone. That changed everything. Radios crackled. Commands shifted. Hope entered the clearing, thin but undeniable. If one brother left, he might still be alive. But the camp told another story too. Of injury, of waiting, of time running out. Wolves didn't rush here. They waited for weakness. As the sun dipped low, the forest seemed to tighten again. The team pulled back reluctantly, marking the site for return. No one wanted to stay after dark. Not with the tracks still fresh, not with the feeling that the wolves hadn't left, only stepped aside. Miles away, Evan lay curled beneath a stand of trees, unaware of the discovery. He dreamed of circles, of being watched without being seen. The forest kept its secrets carefully. By morning, the search would widen and questions would multiply. But the camp would remain what it had become, a place claimed, not destroyed. And somewhere beyond it, the surviving brother kept moving, carrying the weight of what he left behind, unaware that the wolves had finished with one brother, and had not yet decided what to do with the other. Evan woke to the sound of breathing that wasn't there. For a few fractured seconds, he believed Luke was beside him, alive, shivering, waiting for morning. Then awareness returned, sharp and cruel. He was alone beneath a thin canopy of branches, snow dusting his jacket, the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. The silence pressed in so tightly it felt like pressure on his ears. He tried to stand and nearly collapsed. His legs trembled, muscles stiff and uncooperative. Hunger gnawed at him, dull but constant, a reminder of how long it had been since he'd eaten properly. Evan forced himself upright, leaning against a tree until the dizziness passed. The memory of leaving the camp surged back, vivid and unforgiving. He shut his eyes, but the image stayed. Moving helped at first. Motion gave him something to focus on besides regret. Evan walked without a clear destination, following terrain rather than direction, drifting uphill and then down again. Snow erased his tracks almost as quickly as he made them. The forest absorbed him, indifferent and vast. As hours blurred together, the quiet changed. It wasn't empty. It was crowded with small sounds that grew louder the longer he listened. The creak of branches sounded like footsteps. The wind became whispers. Evan caught himself answering questions that hadn't been asked, muttering reassurances meant for someone who wasn't there. He stopped when he realized he'd been talking to Luke. The hallucinations came gradually, slipping in between thoughts. Evan heard Luke's voice behind him, clear enough that he turned, heart racing, expecting to see him standing there, uninjured, smiling like none of it had happened. There was only snow and trees. Still, the voice lingered, accusing and pleading in equal measure. At dusk, Evan found shelter beneath a fallen spruce. He crawled under it, arranging branches for insulation, hands clumsy with cold. His fingers were cracked and bleeding now, pain distant and unreal. He ate the last of his food slowly, chewing longer than necessary, trying to make it last. When it was gone, panic crept in again. Night brought no rest. The forest filled with movement, subtle but constant. Evan heard paws on snow, not close, not far, pacing him. He tightened into himself, clutching the knife, knowing how useless it was. Wolves didn't need to rush him. They only needed him to weaken. Luke appeared again in the darkness, sitting just beyond reach. His face looked wrong, pale and blurred at the edges. "You shouldn't have left," the voice said. "I had to," Evan whispered back, tears freezing on his cheeks. "I had to." The shape dissolved, replaced by shadow. Evan pressed his forehead into his knees, rocking slightly, trying to hold onto something solid. Guilt weighed heavier than hunger, heavier than fear. Survival had stripped the lie from everything. He was alive because he walked away. Morning returned reluctantly. Evan woke tangled in his own thoughts, unsure when sleep had come. He stood slowly, testing himself, and began moving again. His sense of time was broken now, days folding into each other. He walked until his vision narrowed and the world reduced itself to white and gray. When he collapsed again, it was beside a narrow creek half-frozen, water whispering beneath ice. Evan lay there, listening. The sound grounded him, anchored him to something real. He drank carefully, ignoring the pain in his throat, then rested his head against the cold ground. Somewhere far away, a helicopter thudded through the air, too distant to be certain, too faint to chase. Evan didn't move. He wasn't sure he could. He stared up through bare branches, mind flickering between hope and resignation. Alone didn't mean quiet. It meant memory had room to speak, and fear had time to plan. As the light faded again, Evan understood that being found alive would not erase what he carried. It would only force him to keep walking with it, step by step, until someone else finally heard him breathing and decided he was worth saving. Evan woke to the sound of breathing that wasn't there. For a few fractured seconds, He believed Luke was beside him, alive, shivering, waiting for morning. Then awareness returned, sharp and cruel. He was alone beneath a thin canopy of branches, snow dusting his jacket, the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. The silence pressed in so tightly it felt like pressure on his ears. He tried to stand and nearly collapsed. His legs trembled, muscles stiff and uncooperative. Hunger gnawed at him, dull but constant, a reminder of how long it had been since he'd eaten properly. Evan forced himself upright, leaning against a tree until the dizziness passed. The memory of leaving the camp surged back, vivid and unforgiving. He shut his eyes, but the image stayed. Moving helped at first. Motion gave him something to focus on besides regret. Evan walked without a clear destination, following terrain rather than direction, drifting uphill and then down again. Snow erased his tracks almost as quickly as he made them. The forest absorbed him, indifferent and vast. As hours blurred together, the quiet changed. It wasn't empty. It was crowded with small sounds that grew louder the longer he listened. The creak of branches sounded like footsteps. The wind became whispers. Evan caught himself answering questions that hadn't been asked, muttering reassurances meant for someone who wasn't there. He stopped when he realized he'd been talking to Luke. The hallucinations came gradually, slipping in between thoughts. Evan heard Luke's voice behind him, clear enough that he turned, heart racing, expecting to see him standing there, uninjured, smiling like none of it had happened. There was only snow and trees. Still, the voice lingered, accusing and pleading in equal measure. At dusk, Evan found shelter beneath a fallen spruce. He crawled under it, arranging branches for insulation, hands clumsy with cold. His fingers were cracked and bleeding now, pain distant and unreal. He ate the last of his food slowly, chewing longer than necessary, trying to make it last. When it was gone, panic crept in again. Night brought no rest. The forest filled with movement, subtle but constant. Evan heard paws on snow, not close, not far, pacing him. He tightened into himself, clutching the knife, knowing how useless it was. Wolves didn't need to rush him. They only needed him to weaken. Luke appeared again in the darkness, sitting just beyond reach. His face looked wrong, pale and blurred at the edges. "You shouldn't have left," the voice said. "I had to," Evan whispered back, tears freezing on his cheeks. "I had to." The shape dissolved, replaced by shadow. Evan pressed his forehead into his knees, rocking slightly, trying to hold onto something solid. Guilt weighed heavier than hunger, heavier than fear. Survival had stripped the lie from everything. He was alive because he walked away. Morning returned reluctantly. Evan woke tangled in his own thoughts, unsure when sleep had come. He stood slowly, testing himself, and began moving again. His sense of time was broken now, days folding into each other. He walked until his vision narrowed and the world reduced itself to white and gray. When he collapsed again, it was beside a narrow creek half-frozen, water whispering beneath ice. Evan lay there, listening. The sound grounded him, anchored him to something real. He drank carefully, ignoring the pain in his throat, then rested his head against the cold ground. Somewhere far away, a helicopter thudded through the air, too distant to be certain, too faint to chase. Evan didn't move. He wasn't sure he could. He stared up through bare branches, mind flickering between hope and resignation. Alone didn't mean quiet. It meant memory had room to speak, and fear had time to plan. As the light faded again, Evan understood that being found alive would not erase what he carried. It would only force him to keep walking with it, step by step, until someone else finally heard him breathing and decided he was worth saving. Rescuers heard Evan before they saw him. A rasping sound, uneven and thin, carried through the trees as they pushed downslope toward the creek. When they reached him, he tried to sit up and failed, limbs trembling, eyes unfocused. He looked past them at first, searching for someone else. "It's okay," a voice said, firm and practiced. "You're safe now." The word safe didn't land. Evan's lips moved without sound. When he finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "You didn't go back." The team worked quickly. They wrapped him in heat-reflective blankets, checked vitals, stabilized what they could. His body told a clear story: dehydration, hypothermia, exhaustion bordering on collapse. His face told another. Fear hadn't left him. It had settled in. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, Evan's gaze snapped toward the trees. Panic surged suddenly, violently. He clawed weakly at the straps, breath hitching. "The tracks," he said. "Did you follow the tracks?" A medic leaned close. "We found your camp," she said carefully. "We're going to take you out now." Evan shook his head, tears cutting clean lines through dirt on his face. "You can't leave him," he said. "He's still there." No one answered right away. Silence did the explaining. The helicopter ride blurred into fragments. Wind. Noise. Hands holding him down when his body shook too hard. Evan drifted in and out, images bleeding together. Luke's face appeared against the ceiling, then vanished. Each time Evan woke, the same question pressed against his ribs, heavy and sharp. At the field hospital, doctors spoke in measured tones. Evan heard numbers, conditions, words like lucky and remarkable. None of it felt real. He lay still as they warmed him, for lines taped into place, monitors chirping softly. The world had become clinical, bright, painfully quiet. A ranger came later, voice gentle, eyes tired. He explained what they'd found. The camp. The damage. The wolves. Evan stared at the wall, jaw clenched so tight it ached. When the ranger mentioned drag marks, Evan flinched like he'd been struck. "We're still searching," the ranger said. "But you need to rest." Evan turned his head then, eyes burning. "You won't find him," he said flatly. The ranger hesitated. "Why do you say that?" Evan swallowed. His throat felt raw, scraped hollow. "Because they waited," he said. "They always wait." Night came again, but this time with walls around it. Evan lay awake, listening to machines hum. He replayed the moment he left, the way Luke's hand slipped from his sleeve. Survival had carried him here, but it had not carried peace with it. In the early hours, Evan whispered Luke's name over and over, like an apology that could still travel. Being found alive had changed nothing essential. It had only shifted the weight of the story onto him alone. As dawn light filtered through the small window, Evan felt something inside him harden. Survival was no longer about warmth or food. It was about memory. Every detail would be asked for, examined, doubted. He would be expected to explain decisions made under terror, to justify why one brother lay in a hospital bed while the other existed only in tracks and blood. Evan understood then that rescue was not an ending. It was a transition into a different wilderness, one made of questions, silence, and a truth that would not let him rest, no matter how far from Alaska he traveled. It would follow forever. The questions began gently, then tightened. Evan sat in a small room off the ward, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like disinfectant, hands folded together to keep them from shaking. A recorder rested on the table between him and the investigator, its red light steady, patient. Evan stared at it like it might bite. They asked him to start from the beginning. He did, mostly. He talked about the flight, the excitement, the trail fading. He talked about wolves in careful, distant terms. He described weather and injuries and fear in ways that sounded reasonable, survivable. What he left out settled heavy in his chest, pressing against his lungs. When they asked about the last night at the camp, Evan's voice slowed. He described the howls, the circling tracks, Luke's worsening condition. He said he left to get help because there was no other choice. That part was true. It just wasn't complete. The investigator waited, letting silence stretch. Evan filled it with smaller truths. He talked about stacking branches, rationing food, promising to return. He avoided the moment that mattered, the one that replayed whenever he closed his eyes. Eventually, the investigator asked a question that cracked something open. "Why didn't you carry him?" Evan looked down at his hands. His fingers were still split and raw, skin healing unevenly. He imagined trying to lift Luke, imagined sinking into snow, imagined falling and not getting back up. He imagined wolves closing distance while he struggled. His mouth opened, then closed. "I couldn't," he said. The word felt weak. It didn't explain the calculations he'd made in seconds, the way fear had organized itself into logic. Carrying Luke would have slowed him too much. They both would have died. That was the answer survival offered, clean and brutal. But there was more. Evan took a breath that hurt. "He told me to go," he said. He knew. The investigator nodded, but didn't stop recording. "And before that?" Evan's jaw tightened. The room felt smaller. He saw the shelter again, the way Luke's breathing had changed, the way his eyes had focused suddenly, clearly, like he was already somewhere else. He remembered the sound outside the tarp, closer than before. Remembered Luke whispering something Evan pretended not to hear. "He said they wouldn't attack if he stayed still," Evan said. "He said they'd already chosen." The investigator leaned forward slightly. "Chosen what?" Evan swallowed. His throat burned. Who was weak? The truth finally surfaced then, ugly and undeniable. Luke hadn't believed Evan would come back in time. He'd believed the wolves would take him first if Evan stayed. Telling Evan to leave wasn't just hope. It was strategy. It was sacrifice. Evan hadn't argued. He hadn't said he'd stay no matter what. He'd listened. He'd accepted it. That acceptance lived inside him like a second injury, one that wouldn't heal. "I didn't tell anyone that," Evan said quietly. "Because then it sounds like I agreed." The investigator said nothing. The recorder hummed softly. Later, alone again, Evan stared at the ceiling, replaying the decision without mercy. Survival stories loved clean lines, clear villains. Wolves. Weather. Wilderness. They didn't like choices made between two terrible endings. Outside the hospital, snow fell lightly, harmless and distant. Evan closed his eyes, knowing the final truth waited still. He had survived because his brother had not only been injured, but willing. And that was the part Evan refused to say at first, because once spoken, it could never be taken back. It would follow him longer than the forest ever could. Evan understood the search teams would keep looking, driven by duty and hope, but he also understood something colder. Wolves did not erase everything. Snow did not hide every truth. What remained was choice, suspended in time. When officials asked again, when cameras appeared, when silence demanded filling, he would have to decide how much honesty survival required, and how much guilt a man could carry without disappearing entirely himself. The next chapter would begin when he finally chose to speak fully aloud. The search officially ended 3 weeks after Evan was flown out of Alaska. The announcement was quiet, procedural, buried beneath weather reports and local news. No body had been recovered. No definitive conclusion offered. The forest kept what it had taken, and the wolves returned to being symbols instead of suspects. Evan watched the update on a muted television from a rented room he barely remembered choosing. His arm was still bandaged, skin healing unevenly, but the deeper damage wasn't visible. When the ranger on screen said the terrain had become too dangerous to continue, Evan felt no anger. Only a dull recognition. He had known this moment would come long before anyone said it aloud. At night, he dreamed in patterns. Circles in the snow. Tracks crossing, overlapping, fading. In the dreams, he followed them endlessly, always believing the next turn would lead back to Luke. It never did. He woke each time with the same certainty settling into his chest. Some paths were only meant to go one way. He returned home eventually. People hugged him carefully, like he might break again. They called him strong, lucky, a survivor. Evan nodded, accepted the words, learned how to carry them without flinching. He answered questions when he had to, kept his voice steady, chose facts that felt safe to release. Wolves. Weather. Injury. He never mentioned choice. Sometimes, late at night, he opened the last photo on his phone. 2 brothers in front of a tent, smiling at something that hadn't happened yet. Evan studied the edges of the image, the forest behind them, looking for signs he'd missed. There were none. The truth was simpler and harder. The warning had never been visible. It had only been felt. On the anniversary of the disappearance, Evan walked alone through a local park, snow crunching softly underfoot. He stopped when he saw tracks crossing the path ahead. Dogs, not wolves. Familiar. Harmless. Still, his breath caught. Memory didn't care about logic. He stood there a long time, then stepped forward, letting his boots press new marks over the old ones. They pointed away, deeper into the trees, toward a place that didn't promise return. Evan followed them only a few steps, then stopped. He knew better now. Some tracks weren't meant to be chased. Some led forward only by teaching what could never be undone. The forest in Alaska remained unchanged, vast and indifferent. Somewhere within it, the last traces of a brother faded season by season, rewritten by snow, by time, by life moving on. Evan carried what the forest did not erase. The weight of survival. The cost of being the one who walked away. The tracks that mattered most were the ones inside him, etched deeper than snow could ever hold. And they never led back.